Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Dean's Distinguished Speaker Series for Spring 2024. I'm Arun Rupneja, Dean of the School of Hospitality Administration at Boston University. On behalf of the school, I am delighted to welcome all of you, students from all schools and colleges at BU, faculty, staff, our friends from the industry, and I would also like to acknowledge a few special guests today. We have Dr. Barbara Jones, Dean of the School of Social Work, Nancy Caswell, Nancy Cushman, Kate Smith, and our alums, Peter Unger, Steve Curland, and Alec Dalton. Thank you all for joining us. Special thanks to the Computing and Data Sciences Center for allowing us to present our event from this spectacular venue, Boston's largest fossil fuel-free building with unparalleled panoramic views of Boston, which I can see, of course. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this talk is being recorded, and it will be on YouTube next week. After the talk, I invite everyone to join us for a reception right here. Hopefully, it will be picturesque as the sun is setting down to get these views of Boston. So today, our distinguished speaker is Saru Jayaraman. She's the president of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at University of California, Berkeley. She's a graduate of Yale Law School and Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Saru has received many honors for her work, including being listed in CNN's Top 10 Visionary Women and recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014, a James Beard Foundation Leadership Award in 2015, and San Francisco Chronicle Visionary of the Year in 2019. Saru is also the author of 4 books, including her latest, One Fair Wage, Ending All SubMinimum Wage in America. Before Saru joins me on stage, I would like to describe the format for today's talk. First, I'm going to have a few remarks. After that, I will invite Saru to deliver 10 minutes of prepared remarks. At that point, we'll both sit down, and I will ask her questions that are on everyone's minds. At the end, we will have 30 minutes of Q&A so that any questions that I did not ask or I didn't push enough, feel free to ask. We'll have 2 students walking around with microphones. So let me have a show of hands. How many of you have ever worked in a restaurant in your life? It's about 40%. Let's get another show of hands. How many of you have gone out for a meal within the last week in a restaurant? That's practically 100%. So based on this quick survey, it's clear that restaurants and dining are an integral part of our lives. We are passionate about it. We talk about it. We rate restaurants. We give recommendations. We ask for recommendations. The experience of dining out extends beyond physical sustenance and nourishment. When we dine out, often with family and friends, we fortify our need to be cared for, socialize, and have fun and relax. So given our love for dining out, let's talk about the main talk today, which is about the compensation for those on the other side of the aisle, those who are serving us. So we've had a federal minimum wage in America for many, many years, for a long time. It is $7.25 per hour. However, many states have pegged their minimum wage higher than that. And of course, many cities and localities also peg it even higher than the state minimum wage. So for example, Massachusetts, the minimum wage is $15 an hour. However, tipped employees, those who are getting tips, can be paid as low as $6.75 per hour, as long as the tips make up the difference between $6.75 and $15. So in other words, with very few exceptions, the minimum anyone can make in Massachusetts is $15 per hour. So our guest, Saru Jayaraman, has worked tirelessly to eliminate this tipped wage exception. She would like all tipped employees to be also paid the minimum wage. Critics argue that the restaurant industry faces many challenges, which were exacerbated by COVID, and it's not easy to overcome. I do want to note that she has many powerful players in the industry aligned with her and against her. So in today's conversation, we are going to take a deep dive into the pros and cons of eliminating the tipped wage for restaurant and other service workers. Now, we may hold differing points of view on this issue. Our aim here is to facilitate a constructive conversation, even if there is disagreement. That's our role as academic institution, to bring ideas to the forefront. My hope is also that we seek common ground because we are all invested in the future success of restaurant industry. So at this point, please help me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Saru Jayaraman, to make her opening remarks.
Got tangled there for a minute. How is everybody doing? It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the Dean and to the School of Hospitality Management. It's wonderful to be with you, future leaders of the restaurant industry and future leaders of America. Really wonderful to be here with this beautiful view on this beautiful day. Also, I want to say it's wonderful to be with you in this very beautiful historic moment in our industry and in our economy, in which workers across the restaurant industry and the low-wage sector in general are standing up for themselves for the first time, really since emancipation, and demanding more in their workplaces, demanding more because they cannot afford to live on the wages that they've been provided for so long, for too long. A little bit about me. I started this work 22 years ago on 9/11. On September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1, called Windows on the World. On that morning, 73 workers died in the restaurant, and 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy. And I was asked, as a young organizer and attorney, to start a relief center in the aftermath of the tragedy for workers in New York that would initially be a relief center to help people get back on their feet, but quickly evolved into a center of support for workers, first from all over New York and then all over the country, who kept coming to us in very large numbers, telling us their stories, sharing their struggles and their concerns. And everywhere we went following New York, in New York and everywhere else, we would ask workers, what are your top needs and concerns? And they would always say, it's my wages, it's my wages, it's my wages. And as an academic, because I've always been an organizer and an academic at the same time, initially at Brooklyn College, NYU, now at UC Berkeley, always asking the question, why? Why are these workers consistently always bringing up their wages as their #1 source of concern pretty much everywhere we went? And the answer lay both in government data and in history. So we looked at the government data. It showed that the restaurant industry has been one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the United States for decades. Hit 13.6 million workers pre-pandemic. That was 1 in 10 American workers. Largest employer of young people, largest employer of women, largest employer of people of color, largest employer of immigrants, largest employer of new returning citizens. So many different populations have relied on this industry for jobs, and yet it is by far the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States of America and has been for generations. And that's not to say that there aren't incredible, wonderful, amazing, we call them high road restaurant owners, some of whom are in this room. I want to introduce Betty Marcone, who leads, one of the leaders of our High Road Restaurant Association. We're going to an event now at Democracy Brewing, which is a wonderful employer here in Cambridge, in Boston, excuse me, also May's and Mamala's and Comfort Kitchen, wonderful restaurants that are committed to really living wages and equity. So not to say that there aren't those, but unfortunately the data shows as a whole, generally, this is the largest and lowest paying employer in the United States and has been for generations, dating back to emancipation when the wage structure in the industry was created. So pre-emancipation, waiters in Boston were actually mostly white men who received only wages, no tips. Tipping was not prevalent in the United States. It had been in Europe for decades, actually for generations, dating back to feudal Europe, when aristocrats and nobles would give tips on top of salaries and wages to serfs and vassals, always on top of an income, always on top of a stable base wage or income that these serfs and vassals received. When the idea came to the States, it came right before emancipation because something happened. In 1853, waiters here in Boston and New York and Chicago went on strike calling for higher wages, and the restaurants did not want to pay them higher wages and started looking for cheaper labor. So directly after emancipation, they started hiring newly freed black women in particular, telling them, you're not going to get a wage, you're going to live on this new thing called a tip that had just come from Europe. And for the first time in world history, the idea of a tip was mutated here in the United States by these restaurants from being an extra or bonus on top of a wage, as it had always been for generations, to becoming a replacement for wages as a way to allow restaurants to access free black female labor. And that idea that a black woman could be paid nothing and made to live on tips was codified into law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to a federal minimum wage for the first time, but these black women were left out. In fact, multiple black workers were left out of the first federal minimum wage: domestic workers, agricultural workers, and tipped restaurant workers, all black workers excluded. And we went from a $0 wage in 1938 for tipped workers, who were mostly black women at the time, all the way to the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers, which is still an outrageous $2.13 an hour. For the largest employer of women, the largest employer of young people, the largest employer of immigrants, still gets to pay $2.13 at the federal level for a workforce that to this day is overwhelmingly, over 2/3 still women, disproportionately women of color, the occupation with the highest rates of single mothers of any occupation, and the occupation by far with the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry. I just spoke at Harvard Law School just before this, and there's a professor there we've worked with for many years named Catherine McKinnon. Some of you may know she is a legendary law professor who coined the term sexual harassment and fought to make it illegal in front of the Supreme Court. She worked with us for several years on research on these issues in the restaurant industry, and she said, I have never seen an industry with higher rates of sexual harassment, higher than tipped workers, she said, including the military. And that is because you've got a workforce relying on very low wages, made to rely on customer tips, and very vulnerable to whatever a customer might do to you, say to you, treat you, touch you, talk to you, because you rely on the customer to feed your family, not your boss, like every other worker in every other industry. Now, Professor McKinnon said a second thing. She said, not only is it the industry I've ever seen with the highest rates of harassment, it's also that I've never seen a policy more effective at cutting harassment, sexual harassment, than paying people a full minimum wage. She said, even more effective than making sexual harassment illegal, which has been her life's work. And how do we know this? We know this because there are 7 states that many decades ago got rid of the subminimum wage for tipped workers. California, where I live, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska all require a full minimum wage with tips on top, have for decades. And unlike a lot of the scare tactics promulgated by people who oppose me, in particular the National Restaurant Association, and the chains that lead the Restaurant Association, in fact, those 7 states have the same or higher restaurant sales per capita, actually higher small business growth rates than Massachusetts in the restaurant industry, higher overall job growth rates in the restaurant industry, same or higher tipping averages as Massachusetts, and 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment. Because it turns out for this mostly female workforce, when you are paid a full minimum wage by your boss in California, you get tips. It's not that you don't get tips, but you get a full wage, and so you're not completely reliant on the tips. You're not completely dependent on the customer to feed your children, and so you are not willing to put up with as much from the customer because you know you can count on a wage from your boss, like every other worker in every other industry. Because let's be clear, because of this history that I've just shared, and a very political history, because the National Restaurant Association has been lobbying for 100 years since 1919 to maintain this subminimum wage. Because of this political and racial and gendered history, we now have a situation in which we are the only nation on earth in which the restaurant industry is the only industry in the only nation on earth that gets to say, we shouldn't have to pay our workers' wages. You, the customers, should pay our workers' wages for us. And that is not pretty much the way it's done anywhere else. It's not even the way it's done in California or the 7 states that have gotten rid of this. So it was already a problem, a source of economic instability and sexual harassment, obviously a very bad source of racialized and gendered inequity, but it really got so much worse with the pandemic. And that's why I say we're in an incredibly historic moment, because things have changed so dramatically, and workers for the first time since emancipation are saying, we just cannot and will not do it anymore. So with the pandemic, we're coming up on the anniversary of the shutdown, March 13th, 2020. We all remember, hopefully, that day. 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs that day, and that weekend, we were unexpectedly inundated with donations from all over the country, millions and millions of dollars that we handed out to 300,000 workers who came to us for relief, including several thousand here in Massachusetts. Those 300,000 workers told us that over 2/3 of them could not actually get unemployment insurance because in states like Massachusetts, they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits, and their tips did not actually count towards the calculation of benefits. So a lot of them were forced to go back to work before they felt safe, and before they were safe, because the CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place to be during the pandemic for any adult, and UCSF named restaurants the most dangerous place to work above hospitals. And that is why when we surveyed our 300,000 workers who came to us for relief, 1 in 3 said somebody in the restaurant died from COVID. So people died. People died because they were not able to access any kind of safety net, because they were living on a subminimum wage that the government told them was not legitimate or enough to make up for unemployment insurance. They went back to work. They found tips had gone down because sales went down, and harassment, which was already the highest in our industry of any industry, was way up. We heard from literally thousands of women who told us, I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much to tip, which means women were put in the very horrible situation of having to decide between their health and their family's health and the opportunity to potentially earn some income because somebody might like their face and therefore give them a tip. It really very much revealed that what we've been told for so many years, that tipping is exclusively about the quality of service, really wasn't true. Because if it is exclusively about the quality of service, why would you need to see the woman's face before you decide how much to tip her? So this horrible phenomenon, combined with the fact that so many of these workers were asked to be public health marshals on top of being servers and bartenders, they were asked to tell you and I, please, sir, wear a mask, sit 6 feet apart, show me your vaccination card. Workers reported they were tipped less, that they were harassed, that they were screamed at, that they were yelled at. We had a member in Michigan who was punched in the face for trying to enforce one of these laws, and another member who was shot in upstate New York for trying to enforce these rules. And even worse for workers of color. 60% of all workers said they were tipped less and abused for trying to enforce these rules. 80% of black workers said they were tipped less and abused for trying to enforce these rules. And with that, they were done. 1.2 million workers walked off the job, left this industry, said enough is enough. You don't pay me enough to put up with what I put up with, and frankly, you don't pay me enough, period. Because if the government is telling me I earn too little to get the benefits that everybody else I know is getting for working the same number of hours, then I don't earn enough, and I need to go do something else. So mass exodus from this industry. What followed that was something truly miraculous. We tracked 6,000 restaurants nationally, several hundred here in Massachusetts, that voluntarily started raising wages to recruit staff. Restaurants that were previously paying $2 in Dallas, we saw suddenly offering $25 an hour. Restaurants here that used to offer $5 or $6, now offering $30, $35. We saw some restaurants in Cape Cod offering $50 an hour. Restaurants all over the country raising wages to recruit staff in an industry where the trade association had said it can never be done, we can never raise wages, the industry will collapse. We suddenly saw restaurants offering more because They needed to in order to recruit staff. And on the other end, the National Restaurant Association's solution to the worst, the most acute staffing crisis in the history of our industry, they started moving bills in 22 states to weaken child labor laws, including legislation in Wisconsin that would allow 13-year-olds to serve alcohol in bars. That is not a solution. Allowing children to work serving alcohol, getting kids to work in these restaurants, that's not a solution. What the small businesses we've been working with have been saying is, we have to raise wages. There is no other future to get people back into this industry, but we cannot do it alone. We need a level playing field. We need policy that's going to have all boats rise at the same time, and we need policy that's going to signal to workers, come back. It's worth working in restaurants again. And so in response to this marketplace change, we're seeing tremendous success in the policy arena, where we now have 300,000 workers and 2,500 incredible restaurant owners who've joined forces with us to push for policy change. We won this issue in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, in November 2022. On the ballot, 75% of voters voted yes to raising the wage to $16.10. We just won this issue in Chicago, Illinois, 36-10 in the city council, and I just flew in this morning from Illinois, where this is moving with tremendous momentum in the state legislature. Actually, Illinois and Massachusetts are 2 of 13 states that are moving bills and ballot measures to end the subminimum wage for tipped workers and raise wages generally across the economy. And it's quite exciting. There's tremendous momentum. There is a movement for an industry that is more sustainable, equitable, and that allows people to be treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and frankly treated and paid as the professionals that they are. Even for my opponents and I hope we can agree on one thing. The people, the humans in this industry are skilled professionals. They're not disposable. They're humans. They deserve the ability to feed their families while they're working in these jobs. And we want them to be able to stay, to reduce turnover rates, so that we can have better dining experiences, because we all know that the longer a person stays, the better they can hone their craft. The more they're able to move up, the more they're able to open their own restaurants and expand the incredible diversity of our beautiful industry. So hopefully we can agree that we have to find a way to increase the sustainability of working in this industry. And right now, I got to tell you, this is issue number one. It's been issue number one for 22 years, but it's especially at the top of the heap right now. And I'll close with this. I know I'm over time, but I was at the White House on Wednesday. The Vice President Harris asked me to bring a group of incredible AAPI high road restaurant owners to her house for Lunar New Year. And we brought a group of incredible restaurant owners, including Irene Lee from May May's Dumplings here in Boston, Biplau Rao from Comfort Kitchen, and incredible other restaurant owners from around the country. And we got a chance to talk to the Vice President and share with her that things are not great right now. It's not a very happy time for a lot of people. People are struggling, people are frustrated. You only have to look at the responses to Elmo's question on Twitter or X to know that people are not very happy. And in particular, voter polls of young people and people of color in 2024 have consistently showed that the number one issue on voters' minds this election year is the rising cost of living and jobs with living wages. And what she heard, and by the way, followed up with us on this week, is that people who want to succeed in 2024 in politics have to prioritize these issues. There is no other way. And that's true for the industry, it's true for the economy, it's true for our democracy. We are facing incredible challenges with regard to economic inequality and people's ability to survive and stay and live and work live anywhere near the places where they work. And that's why we must address this now, one way or another, hopefully together, workers, employers, consumers, working together for a better future for our industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Saru. That was incredible. I was lost in the speech, so I didn't look at the time as well. but I'm excited to delve into these issues with you. Before we start, I want to ask you, over the last decade, we've had some very consequential events and movements that have happened. I know that you've been fighting, as you said, for the last 20 years, but we also had the George Floyd incident on civil rights. We had the Me Too movement, workers' compensation, as you mentioned, during the pandemic. So the question is, do you see a common thread between what you're doing, or is this in isolation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. So I mentioned we're in an incredibly historic moment. I mean, it's not just my 22 years of organizing. Truly, we have not seen this kind of shift in workers' willingness to put up with these jobs and wages and conditions ever in the history of the United States. I'm sorry, are you hearing me okay? Let me hold it closer to myself. It's truly game-changing, and it is not in isolation. It has everything to do with the pandemic, with the murder of George Floyd, and frankly with inflation and the rising cost of living. All of those things are interrelated, and they're related to the fact that workers reached a breaking point. And amazing and wonderful employers responded to that call for help by workers. So can I just share? What did we hear from workers? First, we heard the government says I didn't earn enough to get unemployment insurance. Maybe I should never have agreed to this amount to begin with. Number two, you always told me if I didn't like it, I could leave. So I'm leaving because I can't put up with it anymore. Number three, and excuse my language here, I'm just going to literally paraphrase what workers said, but they said, I always thought the worst thing that could happen to me as a single mother is I lose this shitty job. Well, I lost this shitty job and I'm still standing, and maybe I should never have put up with this to begin with. So workers had an aha moment, not because they got unemployment insurance and were lazy sitting home collecting unemployment insurance. I just told you, 72% of these workers didn't get unemployment insurance. No, it was because they had a moment, an incredible moment of revelation where they said, I just cannot do it anymore. And on top of that, for me to put up with the kind of abuse I'm putting up with at work, I just cannot do it anymore. So when I say historic, first time since emancipation that largely women, largely young women said enough is enough. And then what else is historic? Historic that so many incredible restaurant owners responded in such magnanimous ways. You know, we had 800 restaurants in our High Road Restaurant Association that Betty helps to lead pre-pandemic, 2,500 restaurant owners today. Many of them coming to us after the murder of George Floyd to say, we have heard you talk about this issue as a legacy of slavery. We want to learn how we might get away with it. But also many of them saying, we know, we acknowledge the data that shows that unfortunately tipping in the United States is not correlated with the quality of service. It's correlated with the race and gender of the server. And that there is now irrefutably an $8 per hour differential between black women and white men working as tipped workers for two reasons. One, because of what we call implicit bias. I hope everybody here knows what implicit bias is. It's unconscious bias, but you can go to the Harvard website and take a test on because all of us have it. Every person in this room who grew up in this country has implicit bias in our head, and that implicit bias results in black women and women of color always getting tipped less, even when they provide what's called perfect service, but then also they get tipped less because they tend to be segregated into lesser tipping restaurants, more casual restaurants where tips are less. So on the whole, we had so many incredible restaurants post-murder of George Floyd said we want to learn how to do things differently. And we saw so many of those restaurants also respond to the rising cost of living, saying we have to pay more. And I just want to share one last thing before I shut up, which is in February of last year, I had two incredible experiences. One, I was invited to speak at a conference of the beverage directors of all the chain restaurants, which was very weird because generally the chain restaurants are my nemesis. But I went and I spoke, and they said, we want you to come speak because everybody's facing a staffing crisis. And I said what I had to say, and somebody got up, and I thought she was going to yell at me, and she said, I just have to ask you, if we don't raise wages, what is the future of this industry? Because we can't find anybody anymore. Right after that, I spoke at the James Beard Chefs Conference, And again, chefs in the room were saying, what do? We can't find people. And agreeing with me that there's really only one solution. We have to pay enough. Again, look, when your wage is $6.75 here in Massachusetts, and at various points gas got to $5 and $6 an hour, and the cost of eggs is, you know, what now, 4, 5, 6? When a coffee costs your hourly wage at Starbucks, are you going to go to work and pay more to get to work than you get in an hourly wage when you get there? It's just not doable anymore, particularly for single mothers.
Saru, can we make it a little bit harder for me?
Yes.
And let me ask questions.
Sorry.
So briefly, so my next question is, you mentioned inflation, the cost of living is rising. So in this inflationary environment, when restaurants are facing such, right, you know, increasing costs, they're going to respond to raising our wages by increasing their prices even more. And customers, we're going to see more increases in prices. And one of the questions is that the consumers might eat out less. As a response to that, they may find other places of entertainment. So. Yeah,
so that's a good question, and it's been a question for years, long before this current moment of inflationary pressures. The response was always, no, we cannot raise wages because then we'd have to increase prices, and that would be a terrible thing. So what we did actually, myself and economists at UC Berkeley, is that we looked at prices, menu prices, in California, where we've always had a full minimum wage with tips on top, not always, but for the last 40, 50 years. And we compared them to menu prices in Massachusetts and New York. Frankly, they're extremely comparable. There's really no difference, and they're actually cheaper in places like Bakersfield and Fresno, California, than they are in Boston. And the reason is that as a whole industry or a whole state has had to raise wages, they've done it together, and they have reduced many costs. They found less turnover, right? So we did a study with the ILR in Cornell and found that, in the School of Industrial Labor Relations at Cornell, and we found that actually you can cut your turnover in half by providing a livable wage and mobility for workers. People will stay. And we also quantified how much turnover costs the industry. It costs the industry hundreds of thousands of dollars per restaurant annually in recruitment, retraining, rehiring. So we have found that prices do not go up pretty dramatically. But let me talk about this moment. Prices already have gone up pretty dramatically without wages going up across the board. And guess what? Workers are facing those same inflationary pressures in the marketplace, in the grocery store that restaurant owners are facing. And so, you know, whether we like it or not, we have to pay people more if we want them to work in these jobs, because they simply can't do it otherwise.
Right, and so you also mentioned that all of these restaurant owners and chefs and, you know, bar beverage managers, they're all saying that they cannot find employees, and that's pretty much all the situation with all service industries. So do you think that it is possible that the economics, the sheer economics, the supply and demand of labor will force the prices up without us having to do anything?
The wages, you mean?
The wages,
yes.
Yeah.
They already are. They already are. We're seeing thousands of restaurants, as I said, raising wages voluntarily to recruit staff. But as I mentioned, a lot of those restaurant owners are saying it is not enough. I, first of all, cannot do it alone. I need everybody to do it. If I'm going to raise my wage as a small or medium-sized business, I need IHOP and Denny's to also have to pay a full minimum wage. It has to be fair across the board. Otherwise, it's very difficult for any individual operator to stick their neck out and do it on their own. But two, they're saying, I'm raising wages, and frankly, I still can't find enough people or retain people over the long haul. We have an incredible restaurant owner in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Ji-Hae Kim. She was also with us at the White House last week. And she told the vice president, she said, you know what, I pay a livable wage. I haven't had as much of a problem finding or retaining people because I pay a livable wage. But in my staff meeting, I asked people who's going to stay in this industry for the long term, and 0 people said they would. And they said, because besides your restaurant, there's no room to grow. There's no industry for us to have a long-term career in or profession, because other people are not paying this. And so until it's an industry-wide uplifting of wages and recognition of the dignity and professionalism and skill of these workers, people are not going to think of this as a long-term career.
Right. So let's talk about, the tipping is part of our culture. And I think it's very difficult to sort of assume that everyone is going to stop tipping. Tipping is going to stay for the foreseeable future. So servers get the sub-minimum wage, and then they get tips on top. And so the restaurant owners have the financial flexibility to perhaps pay the back of the house employees that are not getting the tips, pay them more. So by increasing the sub-minimum wage to a minimum wage, you are now reducing the flexibility of the employers to pay the kitchen staff.
So I think you're assuming that in that whole story you just told, the restaurant doesn't increase its revenue or do better. And what we found is that restaurants that actually pay everybody a livable wage are able to grow and do better, both because they have better staff, longer lasting staff, customers are happier. But there's something else that happens too. So the legislation that we've got moving here in Massachusetts that's going to be on the November 2024 ballot, it's already been cleared to be on the ballot this November. So voters in Massachusetts will have the opportunity to vote on an initiative that would raise wages for tipped workers to the full minimum wage and allow for the employer to set up a tip pooling system, sharing system, so that tips can be shared between front and back of house. This is something we got passed in Congress in 2018, basically a law that said if everybody's paid a full minimum wage, tips can be shared between front and back. Massachusetts is one of only 2 states, Massachusetts and New York, that prohibits tip sharing even when you pay a full minimum wage. And so now we'd have the ability to not only raise wages for the front, but increase income for the back by allowing for this sharing. This sharing, which already occurs in the 7 states that have one fair wage and has for decades, it creates a sense of unity between front and back that just doesn't exist right now in the current system in Massachusetts. It creates a system in which everybody works together to get both a livable wage and tips from the customers. People are able to cross-train. There's a sense of we're all in this together. Whereas right now, a lot of restaurants talk about the fact that my front of house works for the customers and my back of house works for me, and never the twain shall meet, and there's a lot of tension. So there is a way in which you can actually create more flexibility for the employer through this system to do more for the back of the house than you can in the current system.
Right. So I spoke to a restaurateur in Chicago, and he sort of tried this out. Okay, let's pay minimum wage and let's share the tips equally. But the problem was that the other restaurants were not sharing the tips equally. So his best servers, who were getting the most tips and getting more sales for the restaurant, jumped ship and went to other restaurants. So the legislation allows for tip sharing, tip pooling with back of the house, but it does not mandate it. So now you're going to have this differential where some restaurants are doing it and some are not doing it.
Well, in Chicago, it has not been the law until it passed in October, and then it's going to be the law in July of this year. So it hasn't been implemented yet. And what you're going to see in Chicago and Massachusetts once this passes, because it is overwhelmingly popular, it is going to pass. And so we should talk about how to prepare, not anything else, really. What you're going to see is what happened in California and the 7 states, which is that over time, it becomes the culture of the industry to share. Everybody does it because it is now allowed. Every restaurant owner wants to allow for the tip sharing, so it happens in every restaurant. So when you spoke to that employer, they're doing it on their own, but it's not actually required of everybody just yet. It will be a requirement to pay everybody a full minimum wage, at which point you're going to see most restaurants move to a tip sharing model.
The tip sharing, that could also not be mandated between the entire back and the front?
It would be...
That is an option, right?
Yeah, it would be, that's just not how it's ever been done, but I'm telling you, that is what happens when one fair wage is mandated. When you've got everybody paid a livable wage, employers naturally switch, everybody switches naturally to, okay, now we're all paid, we don't need to keep the tips entirely in the front, we can see some sharing between front and back. And I did want to mention, next week is Valentine's Day. It's the highest grossing day in the restaurant industry, when you're going to see literally hundreds of thousands of workers sacrificing time with their loved ones to serve us when we're eating out with our loved ones. And so we have these little cards that you can fill out to express appreciation to your servers. You can go to our website and learn more. but we want you to be able to send a message to servers that you do appreciate the very skilled professional work that they do, and definitely learn more, get more engaged, because this is happening here in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Fantastic. And given that a lot of people have worked in restaurants and go out and eat, I think this will resonate. But I want to pick up the thread with those 7 states where there is no sub-minimum wage. What does your survey find in terms of pooling of the tips between front and the back? Is that practiced by a majority of the restaurants?
Every restaurant. It does mostly tip sharing. I mean, we have something in California called chain of service. It's the idea that everybody who touches your meal, from the dishwasher to the cook to the front of the house, plays a role in your experience. And so there's pretty universal, and I'm not saying it's 50-50, but the idea that you can share tips with the back of the house is pretty universal in those states.
Yep, I think that is one way perhaps to raise the wages in this service industry where wages are not very high.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about what we actually mean by a living wage. So the MIT Living Wage Calculator is a tool for everybody to use. You can go in it, pick a particular state or a particular county. There is nowhere in the United States of America where the minimum wage is even half of the actual cost of living. And what the MIT Living Wage Calculator is looking at is basic, just rent, food, transportation. What you would need as one person, and it allows you to pick your family size, one person, a 2-child, 2-parent household, or a single parent. And when you look at that calculator, you find that minimum wage, even 15, is so dramatically off from what you actually need just to cover the basics here in Boston or anywhere in the country. And so, yes, at this moment, if we're talking about a wage of 15, tips are essential on top of that to get people closer to something that allows them to pay the rent and pay the bills and feed their children. And doing that, 15 plus tips for both front and back creates a much more, the ability for both front and back to get closer to the ability to cover those costs. And again, live anywhere near where the restaurants they want to work at are located.
So I think there were a few years ago, Danny Meyer, the restaurant pioneer who founded Union Square Hospitality Group, and also Shake Shack and other restaurants. He did try this. He put in service charge of 20% to be able to pay a living wage to front and back of the house employees. And his experiment did not succeed, so he went back. Any sort of feedback, any comment on that?
So that's not what Danny Meyer did, and what Danny Meyer did is not the policy that we're advocating for. So to be very clear, the policy that we are advocating for is a full minimum wage. What restaurants choose to do beyond that is up to them. So the most common model in the states that provide a full minimum wage to everybody in the industry is tips on top, tip sharing between all the workers, as I just said. 95 to 99% of restaurants in the 7 states that already do this just have a normal model. You go. How many people here have been to California? When you went to California, did you tip? Overwhelmingly, most restaurants in California and the 7 states have a normal menu, price, bill, tip line, normal. That's what we're advocating for. There's a second model some people have tried, which is called a service charge. Some restaurants here have been doing that recently. That's not what Danny Meyer did. There are both advantages and disadvantages to that. The third model is what Danny Meyer did, which is the least frequently used, most rarest type of model, which is to just have a wage, no gratuity whatsoever, no service charge, no gratuity. And that's what he decided didn't work. He's been an advocate with us for policy that would allow a full minimum wage and tip sharing between front and back. So it's really important that we distinguish between what we're advocating for, which is what we call better wages, better tips, because the states that do this actually have higher tip averages than Boston. Why? I do want to share why that is. So, for years, the National Restaurant Association has been fighting us, saying this is going to kill the industry, it's going to kill tips, it's going to be horrible. In the same moment that they were advocating for that in 2021, the CFO of Denny's, the chief financial officer of Denny's, was caught by Newsweek telling shareholders on a quarterly analyst call that in fact Denny's California grows faster than Denny's anywhere else in the country. Why? He said because workers at Denny's, we pay them more in California, so that guess what? They eat at Denny's. And our customer receipts are higher because our workers eat there, and tipping averages are higher because guess who's the best tippers in the United States of America? Restaurant workers. Because they know what it's like to live on tips, so when they're paid enough to eat out, they tip better. Tipping is higher. So tipping is higher in San Francisco and Seattle than it is in Boston. Alaska has the highest tipping average of any state in the United States that had the same wage with, forever. And so we're not talking about ending, a Danny Meyer model. We're talking about a policy to model what's been done already in lots of states, and frankly, even here in Boston, which is a full minimum wage with tip sharing. If restaurants want to use service charges or go the Danny Meyer model, we're agnostic as long as workers don't lose out, as long as they're doing better, not worse, than they were before.
Right. You mentioned California a lot, and in the recent past, they've passed legislation to increase the wages of everyone working in chain restaurants.
Yes,
so that
fast food, not
fast
full
food.
service. Yes.
Fast food.
Yes.
With a couple of exceptions built in.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see what will happen at that point. The other issue I want to mention, and you say that in those 7 states there is no sub-minimum wage, so I'm assuming the payroll expenses of the restaurant owners is higher as well. And the tips, obviously, when tips, we are used to tipping on percentage, so higher the bill, the higher the tip is. But in the recent past, particularly past the post-pandemic, there is a proliferation of nudges to tip at point-of-sale screens. And I think that to some extent, a lot of people say there's a tipping fatigue. So what will happen to wages if people tip less?
That you're making my point, Dean, because as long as there is a sub-minimum wage that exists in the restaurant industry, other industries are going to want to emulate it. So we are seeing coffee shops introduce tipping and then attempt to drive their workers' wages down from a full minimum wage to a sub-minimum wage. We saw an airline do this. We've seen retailers try to do this. We saw a fast food company try to do this in the Midwest. As long as one set of employers has this exemption, other employers are going to say, well, how come they get to do it? I want to do it too. And federal law, unfortunately, says any worker that gets paid a minimum of $40 a month in tips can be paid a sub-minimum wage, which means every employer is going to say, as long as I get that worker some tips on a screen, I can pay a sub-minimum wage too. So unless we want to be tipping in every single environment of our lives, including here at the university, can you imagine us as professors getting tipped based on whether students like the way we teach or the grades we give? If we don't want to see tipping in every environment, we have to get rid of this exemption. We have to say everybody's paid a minimum wage, otherwise you're going to see tip fatigue. Now, there is tip fatigue, and the Wall Street Journal did report that tips are going to down, which is precisely why you have to pay people an actual wage so that they can cope with the fact that tips are not as high as they were pre-pandemic. That is precisely why we need a wage, otherwise workers aren't going to want to come and work and rely on the ever increasingly unreliable tips that they get in restaurants.
All the students in here, please don't listen to her suggestion of paying any tips to the faculty. We are paid enough by the university, no tips needed. So you mentioned at the beginning the European model, and they started with tips, and we didn't have, and then we started, and so now they seem to have stopped. They pay a living wage through service work, and of course, some of the Americans go in and sort of mess up the whole system by giving tips. So what is in terms of how are they able to do this living wage, and its tipping culture is now so endemic here?
Yeah, well, that story of what happened in Europe is actually because of us, because as I said, tipping originated in feudal Europe. It was something that aristocrats gave to serfs and vassals on top of a wage. It came to the States when we started traveling by steamer ship between Europe and the United States in the 1850s. And initially, Americans resoundingly rejected it. They said, we're a democracy, that's a vestige of feudalism, you should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip, and by the way, we think employers should pay their workers, not customers. And there was an anti-tipping movement at the time. 7 states actually banned tipping. That anti-tipping movement spread to Europe. And the labor movement picked it up in Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s with the rallying cry of, we are skilled professionals, we're not gonna, live on your largesse, that's feudalism. So that anti-tipping populist movement spread in Europe with the labor movement leading it, and they fought for living wages rather than relying on the largesse of customers. It was emancipation and our ugly racial history in the United States, and then the restaurant industry basically using post-emancipation desire to not pay black people that resulted in us going in the exact opposite direction.
So we have a lot of students here. Do you have any message for the students as they enter the workforce?
Yeah. Well, for those going into the hospitality sector, please work with us to build a hospitality sector, a future for the hospitality sector that is more sustainable so that you and all of the beautiful people who work in this industry, 14 million of them, can stay working in this industry, can make a profession and a career out of it. Isn't that why you have a school of hospitality management, is that we're trying to professionalize this industry, this sector, so that people can think of it as a career and a profession, just like a doctor or a lawyer, and stay in it for their lifetime because they love it. Not because it's a throwaway job, but because they love it. They take great pride in it. Anybody who's in the industry, I think, takes great pride in this work. And I would hope that you would value people like I do that work, whether they're a dishwasher or a server or a bus or a delivery worker, that they have a value as a human and the work that they do. So please, work with us. We would love to engage students here in our Massachusetts campaign to win one fair wage and to allow for tip sharing and to honor the great restaurants that are doing this already. So TEFA has a sign-in sheet. We would love it if students or restaurant owners or anybody here would let us know if you'd like to get more information and get engaged. We'd love to work with you. And those of you that are not in the hospitality sector, we would still ask the same thing because you eat out, and this is part of your future too. And frankly, it's part of your future not just because you eat out, but because you live in this country, and this is the largest employer and frankly the largest workforce and the largest voting bloc that doesn't vote because they feel largely ignored, disaffected, and frankly, abused by the political system. And so if we want to save our democracy and we want people across the country to feel some engagement with this country, we have to make sure they have enough to live, survive, and participate in a democracy. A democracy is only a democracy if the people are actually able to afford to engage in it. And at this moment, you have almost 1 in 2 Americans that are working full-time and living in poverty. Almost 1 in 2. The restaurant industry is a huge part of that statistic. And the only way to resolve that is to pay them enough that they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs. They can actually take time off of work to go vote and engage on things like climate change or reproductive rights or any of the other issues we want people to engage on, gun control. How do you, I just have to share with you, we've got this on the ballot in Michigan and Ohio and Arizona. I've been traveling all over the country. We talk to workers, a single mom working in Michigan, Upper Michigan, working 3 jobs, earning $3.75, that's the wage in Michigan. She is not going to take time off of work from 3 jobs to go vote unless her ability to get a raise is on the ballot. So we're putting it on the ballot so that she will actually go vote and vote herself a raise. And once she gets a raise, she's paid 15 instead of 3, she might actually be able to work 1 job or maybe 1.5 jobs instead of 3. She might be able to spend time with her children, and she might be able to engage on the issues we so desperately need her to engage on, like climate change, like reproductive rights, like income inequality, like gun control. There's no way to have democratic engagement unless people have the capacity to live.
We are now going to open the conversation to all of you. There are many, many different vantage points here. Feel free to address your viewpoints and ask questions of our speaker. We have 2 students walking around, Thea and Tristan, with microphones. So please raise your hands and they'll approach you with the microphone.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming out here and speaking to us. And this has been especially enlightening for me because I'm not really in the hospitality industry, I'm just a student at Cass. So I would like to ask you, is there any way individuals outside the hospitality community how can we support one fair wage?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, so many ways. At the lowest level, we would love it if you could sign the petition and get engaged in encouraging your legislators to pass this as legislation. Maybe it doesn't have to go to the ballot. The legislators have a chance to pass it. So the very most basic thing is call your legislator. Support restaurants that are doing the right thing and let them know you're there because they're doing the right thing. But what we would love more than that is for you to sign those sign-in sheets so we can follow up. And there's so many ways for students to get engaged, from helping us do outreach to workers and employers, to helping going and talk to legislators, to doing policy work, to helping with communications. Maybe you don't like to be out talking to people, but you like to be behind the scenes or on a computer. There's so much we can do with you on a computer. We have student interns, for example, who are scraping job postings off Indeed and finding restaurants every day, new restaurants that are paying more, identifying them so that we can reach out and bring them into the fold.
Thank you. First of all, I'm a restaurant owner, and I'm also a SHA graduate. So I would just like to say a couple quick things. First of all, I think that everybody should have a fair wage. Regardless of anything else, everybody deserves a living wage. We don't have one employee working in our restaurant who's making minimum wage. Every single one is making more than minimum wage. The issue becomes, for us, is the disparity. So we have cooks who make $20 an hour. We have servers who are making $6.75 an hour, plus $25 in tips. So those people are making $32 an hour. So by raising the wage of the people making $32 an hour and not spreading the tips, for the example, all of a sudden they're making a ridiculous amount of money, or a very high amount of money. And I think that's the issue that needs to be divided first. So there's a balloon full of money, and it can only be squeezed one way or the other. So you can level it out. You could equalize the wages. So everybody would make $25, $26 an hour, and that would be great for the back of the house people who are getting increased. But obviously, the people who are getting more than that will, like Danny Meyer's staff did, they'll walk across the street. Now, if you do it statewide, at least it's a fair level playing field. But in order to inflate that balloon, we're basically saying to the restaurants, you need to come up with that extra $8 or $9 an hour times thousands of hours a year. So a restaurant makes right now about 5% average profit in countrywide. So to add that money really takes it out of the restaurant's pocket. One thing that we've talked about a lot that we've had success with is a back-of-the-house fee. And I know some of you know what that is, but the back-of-the-house fee idea is you have a specific fee designated to the back of the house, increases their wage and benefits directly. So you charge a 3 to 5% fee, and that tends to equalize the wage. Meanwhile, minimum wage is increasing. So that is, to some degree, equalizing the playing field. Certainly could go up more, and as long as it's fair, I think it's across the board. But I just wanted to point out that the difficulty for the restaurants is not that they don't believe in a fair wage. The difficulty is that they're operating with a system where every part of that money comes out of their pocket.
Right, so first, it's wonderful that your workers make a lot of money in tips. I do want to point out that the overwhelming majority, unfortunately, of workers work in very casual restaurants and bars where they do not make $25 an hour in tips. A worker at an IHOP, a single mom at an IHOP will make, a couple of dollars, not $25 an hour in tips. And so I do think there's a disparity between often white workers in fancier fine dining restaurants or even upscale trendy restaurants, and then often women and women of color working in very casual restaurants and bars. So that's number one. Number two, what we are pushing for is statewide, a statewide initiative that would raise the minimum wage for tipped workers and allow for exactly what you're saying, tip sharing. So I'm sorry, I don't know your name, sir, but
Steve.
Steve, you wouldn't have to do that back of house fee if everybody was allowed to share, and if there was a full minimum wage and everybody's allowed to share in the tips, you wouldn't have to have a back of house fee. And I'm sure many of you have heard that the Federal Trade Commission has come out with a proposed rule that would, that's around junk fees, that actually would prohibit these kinds of service charges, mandatory service charges altogether. So instead of continuously adding more fees, let's just pay everybody a full minimum wage and share tips between front and back to get away from the kind of disparity that you're talking about. And we've seen incredible restaurants do really innovative things with a full minimum wage and this kind of allowance for tip sharing with the back of the house. That actually is a cleaner, easier model. It's something that customers are, very accustomed to, just a tip instead of additional charges for back of house, front of house. And it also, as I said, creates this unity between front and back. I do want to say the initiative that's on the ballot phases in the increase over several years. So you were saying it's a jump from 675 to 15. Yes, absolutely essential, because unfortunately that 675 has been artificially suppressed for way too long. So it does have to go up quite significantly, but it's not happening all at once. It's happening over a couple of years. And we have created a calculator that we'd be happy to show you that allows you to input your menu prices and your staff size. And it shows you how over a couple of years you can profitably increase the wage by adjusting menu prices, staffing, all of these things. And not only do we have the calculator, we have real case studies, employers who've done it, who are happy to get on the phone with you and tell you how they've done it. We have an association that Betty helps to lead of 2,500 restaurant owners that are happy to provide guidance to peer restaurant owners on how they've done it profitably and successfully.
So, Saru, I know that you said it's going to be phased in over a couple of years, but at what point in that phase-in period can the tips be shared between front and back? It's not
Federal
instant.
law has to be a full minimum wage. But that's why in places that we've passed this, some employers say, you know what? I'm just going to go all the way to the full minimum wage so that I can do the tip sharing. I'm not going to wait for the several years. But we do the several years so that most employers have the chance to adjust.
Hi, my name is Kate. I actually am a restaurant owner in the city, and I'm all for all of this. But the concern, again, is with the lag period. And I'm mostly just curious, for states that have phased it in, but that have restaurants that jump ahead and do this, how do they tend to fare? Because that's probably where we'll be, but it's not an easy spot to be.
Yeah, totally. Well, the nice thing is once the bill is passed, it's not like one restaurant that jumps ahead. A group of restaurants jump ahead, and they're able to kind of do it together and talk to each other and form kind of a peer network of folks that are sharing with each other. Quite the most common thing that people do lately is a service charge. And I will say the FTC rule says no mandatory service charges, but there's no prohibition on voluntary service charges. So many restaurants are saying, let's go ahead and go all the way, add the service charge, make it voluntary. If you're going to do that, what both the Attorney General and we are really recommending is just clarity and transparency. What are you doing with that service charge? Because consumers are really confused. Do I tip on top of that? Where does it go? And so I just think what was really important is clarity, transparency, and the ability for restaurants that want to figure it out to do it together.
Hi, first of all, thank you for the amazing conversation we had. I had a quick question. If you go to restaurants in New York, they have a minimum gratuity level. If you come in with 6 people, if you come in with 7 people, they always have a set minimum gratuity level. What's your idea on that? So that it's based on tips, so that you meet the minimum wage?
Yes. So that happens, that was a protection for workers because we do get so many tourists in New York City from Europe and other places where people aren't used to tipping, and a worker will serve a very large party and then get very little. And again, that's a problem when you're earning a sub-minimum wage and you're entirely reliant on the tips to feed your family. So that is important. The thing I like about automatic, not everybody likes automatic gratuity, a set amount. The thing I like about it, and this is what we heard from a lot of employers post-murder of George Floyd, is as I mentioned, unfortunately there is now irrefutable data that tipping in this country, when we leave it to you to figure it out, is not based on the quality of service. It is based on the race and gender of the server, and sometimes even more horrific things. Like, there have been studies that show that a woman will get tipped more if she allows herself to be touched. A man gets tipped less if he touches the customer. His height, her eye color, her hair color, her breast size, all have an impact on her ability to get tips. So that is why in many instances, like a set amount is preferable to me in many instances than, as long as it goes to the workers, a set amount can be preferable to just leaving it open for everybody to figure out.
I really like the idea of tip sharing, but wouldn't that affect like the level of service that like the tipped worker will offer to the customer?
Yeah, it would get better. It would get a lot better because, again, when you eat out, your experience is not just the person who brings you the food or takes your order. Your experience is partly the food on your plate. And who's putting the food on your plate? Who is creating the meal the way you want it made? It's the back of the house. And so if everybody is joint in their efforts to access the tips that the customer might provide, then it becomes a team effort to both produce the meal just as the customer wants it and to bring it to the table the way the server wants to bring it. So we see better service when everybody's in it together rather than just one set of workers gets the tip and the other doesn't. And I do want to say, because again, lots of fear-mongering around this, actually, workers in California, and we have studied what we call quintile. You know what a quintile is, right? It's a fifth. Every quintile of workers, from the top tip earners to the lowest tip earners, we've compared to the similar quintile here in Boston. And they make more in wages and tips, even with tip sharing in California, at every quintile, from the workers at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco all the way down to the IHOP workers in Fresno and Bakersfield. They make more in every quintile than the workers in Boston because there's just more money. People are paid better. They eat out more. Tipping is higher. And so the sharing doesn't cut into the top tip earners' total amount they take home. It increases it. Everybody's happier.
Hi, my name is Mira. I'm a sophomore in SHA. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I do have a question. So I know that in the restaurant industry, it has some of the slimmest profit margins to begin with of any industry. And just within the expenses of the restaurant industry, labor is the highest expense to begin with. And so I know that you explained how revenues will eventually increase as this wage is implemented, and that it will be kind of phased in slowly. But I'm just curious to hear you speak a little bit about whether or not, as this wage is implemented, if that increased in costs will cause extra pressure to be applied on other areas of the industry, and if you've seen anything in terms of restaurants who have implemented a higher wage to then have to decrease in other areas, including the number of people who they're able to hire.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are 7 states that have already done this, and I think we brought copies of a report that actually small business restaurants in California over the last year grew by 12.9%, while small business restaurants in Massachusetts decreased by 1.9%. So that is a 14% gap between growth in small businesses in California compared to Massachusetts. And again, that is because when you pay people better, as the CFO of Denny's said, that allows for increased customer spending, increased customer revenue. People, guess what? Workers are consumers too. They're not just robots. They're not workers. And so when they eat out, it supports small business. It supports the industry. So it's not a zero-sum game. When people are paid more, the restaurant does better. They're able to grow. They're able to, like Denny's, grow faster. Small businesses growing faster. Turnover is less. And so that small profit margin grows when you've got a stable workforce that isn't constantly churning. I mean, there's some real statistics that we've looked at. Employee turnover, which as I said can be cut in half by paying people a livable wage, employee morale, employee theft, quality of service, customer happiness and return. All of those things are impacted by the longevity and happiness and morale of your staff. Danny Meyer, regardless of what we talked about, is still one of the most successful restaurant owners in the country. If you read his book, Setting the Table, one of the first things he said is the first place to invest is your staff. Why? Because they are the ones interacting with your guests. If you're a customer-facing business, you have to invest in the happiness of your people. They're the ones who are going to sell the wine, sell the alcohol, sell the food. If you want upselling, guess who's going to do it? Not you, the worker. And so there are all these gains to be had, not just losses, by paying people more. And the evidence ultimately is in the states that have done it, that are where the restaurant industry is growing faster than Massachusetts.
Hello, thank you for being here. I was just wondering, like, going back to like the level of service and tipping, you're using the example with California and how raising the wages, they've seen like an increased level of tipping. Do you think that could be due to a lack of awareness about the legislation in place? So people there are still tipping the same way they'd be tipping, say, in Boston, but the reason then it would be higher is because their menu items are higher, plus California's inflation due to here, whereas if something was to be implemented on more of a national level and break headlines and stuff, given like the tipping fatigue that we established, don't you think that there would be like a large decrease in tipping if people come to realize, oh, they are making a livable wage, we don't need to be tipping like this anymore?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that was the argument made in Washington, D.C., where, like Massachusetts, we put it on the ballot. There was a decade-long fight over the issue. We won it 3 times, and each time the Restaurant Association tried to get it reversed. We finally won it November 22, once and for all. 75% of the voters, wasn't able to be overturned. November 23, we did a 1 year later look at the industry. What did we find November 23? 10% more restaurants since November 22, 7% more restaurant jobs since November 22, 6.8% higher wages and tips since November 22. So all the fighting over a decade long, you're talking about a year fight in Massachusetts, you're talking about a decade in DC of this being a huge topic of conversation. Tipping has not gone down in DC. But I think the even better thing I would say to you is, we've been at this for several years here in Massachusetts. It's gotten press. We've been in the Boston Globe, we've been in the Boston Herald, we've been on television. There's going to be press at the event I'm heading to right now, which I really have to go to in a few minutes. And many, many restaurants, 300 of them in fact, in Massachusetts have raised wages. You don't know who they are, and you're not tipping less because you don't know who they are. And frankly, the bottom line is you don't go into a restaurant and ask a server how much do you earn before you decide how much to tip. It's just not what tipping is based on. Most people, again, I'm going to tell you, the research shows tipping is not correlated with people's thinking about how much people earn. Unfortunately, it is correlated with many other negative things that are not the quality of service or how much the person earns. And I mean, DC provides the very best example that negates your argument.
Dr. Modi, last question to him since Saru has to leave.
Okay, Saru, so I'm going to pick on something you said about the MIT calculator and $15 an hour in Massachusetts. That's certainly not livable. Have you found in states like California where tips are added on top of that, does it bring a person to what you would consider livability and not just minimum? And my second question is around how we actually just think about this, and this is maybe a little utopian. If we are to attract a long-term sustainable workforce, and a skilled workforce at that, if that's how we consider them, shouldn't we be thinking about a thriving wage as opposed to a minimum wage or a livable wage? Because if I'm a lawyer and I'm a skilled professional, I'm certainly not thinking I'm going to go into a career with a livable wage, but a wage that I can thrive at. So, yeah. And that may go beyond the restaurant industry to other industries where minimum wages are.
Absolutely. And there are restaurants, many of them all over the country, that are actually looking at thriving wages. I'm sure many of you have heard of or studied or been to Zingerman's in Michigan, and Paul Saginaw from Zingerman's was a member of High Road Restaurants for years before he retired from Zingerman's. They've been talking about thriving wages at Zingerman's for a long time, over a decade. So there are restaurants in San Francisco that have moved to a salaried model because they believe workers are professionals in this industry. There are restaurants even in the South that we're seeing that have tried to move to thriving wages. So couldn't agree with you more. We have to go beyond, we have to keep thinking, but the first step has to be, for God's sakes, let's just make sure everybody's paid a minimum wage. That should not be an argument or a fight. Let's just get everybody a minimum wage. On top of that, we need to talk about what is the minimum wage? How close is it to the cost of living in Massachusetts? On top of that, we need to, yes, think about thriving wages. But first step, let's make sure everybody gets a minimum wage. And yes, in states that have done this, when you have a minimum wage and tips on top, you do get closer to the cost of living, but we always can do better.
I think I'm going to say on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for coming here and
Thank you.
educating us about this issue, and thank you for your passion.
Thank you so much.